What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 3 of our 8XT Nitro truggy build. If you missed our first 2 episodes so far, make sure you go back and check those out. But this build, or this episode, is consisted of shocks and turnbuckles, so it is a little bit of a longer episode, around 13 and a half minutes. So it's just going to be general, put together, not too many tips in this one. Just follow along with the manual and you'll be perfectly fine. So the nice thing about these shocks is they already come assembled, kind of. As you can see, like the shock collar, the cap, and the cup to hold all the bushings and seals is already assembled on the shock, but then you have to take them apart to put the seals and the bushings in the shock, so it saves like baggage and space in the box, but in the long run it kind of sucks because you have to take it apart to put it back together, but oh well. And you can see here I'm tightening that bottom cup with pliers. Be careful on that. You don't want to scratch like the black off of the aluminum there. It's not going to really enable the shock. It's just kind of going to look gross. So just be careful when you're turning those. You don't want to scratch them. So right here, I just grabbed shock shaft pliers. These are Tlr shock shaft pliers. Any shock shaft plier will work. Basically what this is, it's got a certain measurement for a certain size shock shaft. There's a little ridge cut out in there that you can hold the shock shaft with without scratching it, because you do not want to scratch the shock shafts. When you scratch a shock shaft, you basically want to throw it away, because at that point it can cut your seals and it's not going to hold oil the same, and the shock's just not going to work as well as it used to. So get a good pair of shock shaft pliers. I would not recommend using regular pliers. If you have to, maybe put like a microfiber towel in between the pliers to hold the shock shaft with, but I would definitely recommend picking up a pair of shock shaft pliers. Now, when installing these shock boots onto the shock bodies, I noticed that when you go to put the shock shaft with the piston in, my pinky could actually fit inside the shock body, so I would put the piston and the shock shaft in there. There we go, forgot the name for a second. And then I would hold it in with my pinky and I could be able to pull the shock boot down over the shock shaft. And then again, holding the shock shaft with the shock shaft pliers to turn those bottom eyelets on. Again, I'm started with my hands, maybe not this one. There we go. Got it started with my hands, and then I just went ahead and tightened it up with a wrench, just a little bit easier and faster to turn on there. Now the eyelets, you basically just screw up until the bottom of the eyelet is flush with all the threads. Oil, I believe we're doing the front shocks here. Pretty sure this is 37.5 weight oil. We might see the bottle here in a second so it can show us, but letting the air bubbles rise to the top here. Yep, 37.5, there it was there. So just letting all the air bubbles rise to the top while I get the seals inside the shock caps. Get the shock cap on with the shock tools that come in the kit. I recommend using those. It's a lot easier to get them on. And then you go ahead and bleed the shock. I'm not going to explain how to bleed the shock right now. We do have videos on that, so if you guys want to learn how to bleed a shock, you can go watch that. But pretty simple process. Bleed the air out of the shock, wipe it off, and you're good to go. Now on to the rear shocks. I believe this was 35 weight oil. I might be wrong on that. Nope, 32.5 it looks like is what we put on the rear. So 37.5 in front, 32.5 in rear. and I believe these were a 6-hole by 1.3 piston. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what the piston size was, 6-hole 1.3. So fill the shocks up, let the air bubbles rise to the top, and then you go ahead and bleed the air out like we did with the front shocks. Go ahead and pop the small steel bushing or cup into the bottom of the eyelet, and then we're going to go ahead and put the spacers inside the top shock caps. Make sure you pay attention to the orientation of these depending on how you want to mount your shocks onto your shock tower on your car. You want to make sure that the direction is correct on these before you pop them in, because they're kind of tricky to get back out once you pop them in there. Alright, so installing these spring collars, I kind of just put a little bit of oil on the seal in there, and then they slide up a little bit easier. Now we're going to go ahead and skip through the rest of these because it's pretty much the same process for all 4 of them. Just put a little bit of oil, screw them on, and then they go on no problem. So now we're finishing up the last one here. Now one thing that I make sure to do on all my shock collars is get a pair of calipers and measure the length of the shock collar. So you want to make sure they're the same on every shock. And then I take a white paint marker, like you can see there, and put a little line on the shock collar. That way, so when the shocks are on the car and you go to adjust your ride height and turn them, you can count the turns consistently when you turn the shock collars. That way you know they're even. And you just count once that white line comes around again, that's 1 turn, and so on. So that's just a little nice tip that I like to do for my shocks. I usually do that on all the cars. And that's pretty much it. Shocks are done. Just got to put springs and spring cups on, and then it'll be all done with the shocks, and we'll move on to turnbuckles. Alright, so now on to our turnbuckles here. Definitely not anything exciting for turnbuckles. I do have one recommendation that we'll get into right now. Is I grabbed my power drill, and you put the turnbuckle inside the drill. Be careful that you don't mess up the threads on the turnbuckle. But this way you can put a little bit of black grease on the turnbuckle rod ends, and you can thread them in much easier with a turnbuckle with a drill, than by hand, and they'll go much quicker. And when you thread them in and thread them out a couple times, it makes them easier to adjust. They're not going to be as stiff when you go to adjust them when they're on the car. So that's one thing I really like to do. Once you get these started, you just measure it to the setting in the manual, which I found is not correct at all. So maybe later on I'll put the measurements that I use for my turnbuckles, because the ones they give in the kit are not even close to the correct camber and toe settings for the truck. So we'll get moving on the rest of the turnbuckles here. Now you got to make sure when you thread these in and out that you only do 2 on one side of the turnbuckle, and then you take the turnbuckle out and flip it like we're going to do here in a second. So you take the turnbuckle out, flip it, so that the threads are reversed on the other 2 rod ends. So just make sure you don't do all 4 in the same direction, because each side of the turnbuckle, the threads are actually reversed so that it threads in and out evenly on both sides. Now the thing I'm using to turn these turnbuckles on is the Tlr Turnbuckle Wrench. So it has 3 different settings on it for all turnbuckles, so 10 scale, A scale, and I believe like a smaller, like a mini scale almost. It's got all those different sizes for different size turnbuckles on there. Makes it much easier to turn that on, or put the turnbuckles together. I put a wrench through the rod end and then turn the actual turnbuckle with the turnbuckle wrench. So it's a lot easier to get them started and get them on the turnbuckle. Now we're almost wrapping up the end of our last build episode, so I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Not super exciting, just turnbuckles and shocks, but I guarantee you the next episode we'll get into some front end building on the truck, so make sure you stay tuned for that one. And thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed.